Hey guys, so today we're talking about sine and cosine graphs. We aren't going to actually draw any of them. We're just going to look at a couple of the properties. So I have on my paper the graph of y equals sine of x. And hopefully you graph these in Math 3, so it shouldn't be super brand new, but if not, that's totally okay. So when you have a sine and a cosine graph, they oscillate back and forth like this one forever and ever and ever. And for every graph that you have for a sine, there's a matching graph for cosine. It just has a shift. It's called a phase shift. So in this one, if we look at our y-intercept here is at the origin, and then the graph goes up to the max, down to the min, and then it goes up to the max, down to the min, and it'll just go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth forever. So today we're looking at amplitude and we're looking at period. So the amplitude really is how high and how low that the graph goes. So to find the amplitude, you do the absolute value of A, and we'll write what A is here in just a minute. And it is the distance between the midline, which we'll define here in a second, the midline and the max, or the midline and the min. So since we have midline in our definition, let's write what the midline is. So to find midline, it is y equals d. And for us, we're just going to look at when our midline is 0. So our value of d is always going to be 0. But the midline is the vertical line that kind of cuts the graph in half. Okay. So it is always halfway between the min and the max. So if we look at our graph, our minimum is at -1 and our maximum is at +1. So we know that halfway between that is going to be 0. So that is the x-axis. And so like I said, that's always going to be our midline. We're not going to look at any midlines other than 0. Okay, but the other thing we are going to look at is the period. So to find the period, first thing you have to decide is, are you talking about degrees or are you talking about radians? Well, if we look at this graph that I drew up here, if you look at the x value, we've got pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, etc. So you know that those are radians. They don't have the degree symbol, and they also have pi's in them, so that tells you that they're radians. So for us, to find the period, we're going to do 2 pi divided by b. And again, we'll write what b is here in just a minute. So if we look at this graph up top, 2 pi is right here. And if we look at it, we started at our y-intercept of 0. We went 0 to the max, 0 to the min, back to 0. Then we go 0, max, 0, min, 0. So that's the time that it took to make one rotation, the time it takes for it to start repeating itself. So the period is the time it takes for the graph to make one rotation. and start repeating itself. Okay, so I've got all these A's and B's and C's and D's, and you're like, what in the world is all that? So let's write, in general, the formula for these sine and cosine functions are y equals A sine of B x minus C plus D. And it's the same for cosine. Y equals A cosine B x minus C plus D. So if we're talking about the amplitude is the A. So it is what is being multiplied to the sine. So in our original, if we look in front of the sine, there's nothing being multiplied there, so you know there's always an invisible 1. Well, if we look at our graph, we said the amplitude was the distance between the midline, which we already decided was 0, and the max. Well, our max is 1. If we look here, our amplitude, A, in front we have a 1. So that's where that comes from. So B helps us find the period. So in this one we had, well, B is what's being multiplied by the X. So if we look at our X here, again, nothing there, so there's always an invisible 1. So if we do 2 pi divided by 1, that gives us 2 pi. Well, we already decided that 2 pi was the time that it took for it to start repeating itself. And then the C is called a phase shift, and that is a shift left to right, and we're not even worried about that for now. If you do pre-calc, you'll graph those, and Miss King or Miss Doherty will explain it better than I can. And then the D is your midline. So that is, again, is the graph that, or the line that cuts the graph in half. And if you have plus or minus, that moves the graph up or moves the graph down. Like I said, we're just worried about it being 0 now, but that's all it does. The points stay the same. The only thing that changes is, again, it shifts up or down, so your maxes and your mins will change. So let's do one. So what we're going to do today is we're just going to find the amplitude and the period. So let's say we have y equals 4 sine of 2x. So we want to find our amplitude and we want to find the period. So the amplitude is always going to be positive because it is a distance. And so you know you can't have a negative distance. So that's why you want to take the absolute value. And so it's the absolute value of whatever is being multiplied by the sine or the cosine, so whatever's out front. So in this one, that is 4. So if we do the absolute value of 4, then that's just 4. And then for the period, we want to do 2 pi divided by, and then whatever number is being multiplied by the x, which is our b value. So in this one, that's 2. So if we do 2 pi divided by 2, we know 2 divided by 2 is 1, so that leaves us 1 pi. That's it. Let's do another one. So let's say we have y equals -3 cosine of x divided by 4. And again, we want to find our amplitude and our period. So So for the amplitude, again, it's absolute value of whatever is out front, whatever is being multiplied. So in this one, we're being multiplied by a -3. So we want to find the absolute value of -3, which we know is +3. Now, for this one, the period, again, we do 2 pi divided by. I don't know if I explained this. It's so hard to teach nobody. But if we have 2 pi, you know that is how many radians are in one complete circle. So if you want to think one complete rotation, one complete circle is 2 pi. It's the same as 360 degrees. So that's why we're taking the 2 pi and dividing it, because we're saying, well, originally 2 pi is one rotation, so we're altering it with those numbers that are being multiplied. So in this one, if you look at it, we have x divided by 4. So you might just think, well, we'll do 2 pi divided by 4. But you want what's being multiplied by the x. So you know that you can take that x, you can pull it out of that fraction, and then that becomes 1/4 x. So 1/4 is what you are multiplying by. So I do 2 pi divided by 1/4. And then you don't want to type the pi in the calculator because you don't want to lose it. You can do 2 divided by 1/4. If you remember doing it by hand, you just keep, change, flip, and then that'll leave us 8 pi. Okay, so then the other thing that you're going to do today, or at least try, if you can't get them exactly, it's okay, is writing the equation when you're given a graph. So let me draw a graph real quick. Let's say we have this graph here. So the first thing that you have to decide is the graph going to be a graph of sine, or is it going to be a graph of cosine? And so to do that, you look at the y-intercept. So if your y-intercept is at the midline, then it's going to be sine. If your y-intercept is at the max or min, it's going to be cosine. And so, like I said, for today, our midline is always going to be 0. So we're looking at, is our y-intercept at the origin? And it is. So that tells me that this is going to be a sine graph. So now we want to find the amplitude. So we said amplitude was the distance from the midline to the max, or the midline to the min. So if we look at our midline, again, we know it's 0. They're always going to be 0 today. And if I look, my max is 3. My min is -3. So the distance between those is 3. So when we write this, y equals 3 sine. Now, the other thing that you have to do is figure out what b is. So to find the period, we did 2 pi divided by b. So to find b, you do the opposite. So to find b, you do 2 pi divided by the period. And so those two values just switch. So if we look at this one, it only has one rotation, so it's not too hard to figure out, but we went midline, max, midline, min, midline, and our x value there is pi. So to find b for this one, we would do 2 pi divided by pi. Our pi's would cancel out and we would get 2. So it would be sine of 2x. And so real quick, let's look at one that, just so you can see what a cosine looks like. not perfect, sorry. But there we go. So a cosine is going to be the same exact shape. It's still going to be a little swervy, but again, the difference is your y-intercept. So if we look at this one, our y-intercept is at a max. So that's going to tell me that it is a cosine. Let's go 4 pi, 3 pi, 2 pi, 1 pi. Okay, so now to write the equation, again, we decided that it was cosine because our y-intercept is at the max. So we want to look for our amplitude. Again, our midline is always 0 today. So if I count up, my max is at 2, my min's at -2. So that tells me my amplitude is 2. So y equals 2 cosine. And now we just have to find that b. Again, it's just one rotation. And our x value there is 4 pi. So we do b equals 2 pi divided by 4 pi. Our pi's would cancel. 2 divided by 4 is 1/2. So you could write it cosine 1/2 x. You could write it x over 2. It doesn't matter either way. And there's that. I think there are 4 of them on your worksheet. You can just try them. If you can't get them, it's okay. But I wanted to show you those because there are a couple on there if you want to try them. And I think you did that in Math 3. I'm not for sure. But hopefully you remember, or hopefully this video helped you. But as always, let me know if you have any questions. And I hope to see you guys soon. Bye.